Greetings, friends. Ruski here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of May 20th through May 26th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates, make sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. Alrighty, let's get into the events that happened in the last week. We're going to begin in the Kharkov direction. So this actually, the Kharkov direction has actually slowed down. It's actually been in a stalemate. I actually really have nothing to update you guys here. Yeah, there's been no changes. The reason for this is because the Ukrainians have finally redeployed a lot of their reserves, strategic reserves and reserves from other front lines to this area. And because the Russians have only deployed a very small percentage um, of their forces here, that basically allowed them to be slowed down to a halt. And I mentioned this last video is that the Russians have finally reached the first line of Ukrainian defense, and once they did that, that's when it became a slow grind like we see in the Donbass. However, now the Ukrainians outnumber the Russians in this front. There's a lot of talks of a counterattack. So one thing, a lot of the sources are saying the Ukrainians are gathering in Ruskitishki, Lipsy, and trying to just drive forward here, and they'll be able to stage here and then try to attack and push the Russians back to the international border. And the other place where people are saying there might be a counterattack is they're accumulating forces in Kolotsky, and they are trying to do it like a flanking attack, attacking the Russians in the flanks right here, and then driving, the Russians are bogged down in urban combat in Volchansk, and then getting them, because I'm pretty certain that, Russian defenses here are very, very poor. Speaking of Volchansk, the Russians are still battling for the northern part of the city. There's been some geolocated footage showing that the Russians are still trying to push the Ukrainians fully out of this area. So, there's still heavy urban combat, and it's not complete. The northern is not completely secured yet, and it will only be secure. And I'm pretty certain the Russians can clear the northern part of Volchansk, but now there's a river separating the southern Volchansk from northern Volchansk. And when they do clear the northern part, it's going to be a question of if they'll be able to cross the river and continue operations in southern Volchansk. So north is not as cleared as we assumed. And so, in terms of if the Russians had any big plans, it looks like they're in Kharkov. They are going to be taking a lot longer than expected. That being said, if the goal, which I mentioned in my other video, that the whole point of this operation was to drag Ukrainian reserves here, then they did one of their main jobs. Putin also said that the main purpose of this was also to create a buffer zone. And so, they started it, but obviously this is not enough to push the Ukrainians fully away from Belgorod. So, they have to continue pushing. But the Ukrainians put a lot of troops here. Now, in my opinion, the Russians are actually going to do their main offensive, or at least, again, it's not going to be a big aerial offensive. It's going to be, the Russians are going to, it's going to be like Avdiivka or Bakhmut. It's going to be, very intense fighting, and, very strong offensive action at the tactical level. We won't see some sort of big World War II style breakthrough. It's going to be slow grinding for the next few months in the summer as the Russians improve their situation in Donbass. And this is where the Russians will focus. And they opened Kharkov, and they might open Sumy to kind of drag Ukrainian reserves so that they can't plug the holes as easily in Donbass. That's my opinion. But yeah, the Ukrainians haven't counterattacked yet, but that is what might happen. So because of that, the Russians are pretty much on now the defensive. They're trying to secure the gains they have already had. So there's not much changes in the Kharkov direction, but that is the update there. Now, there has been a lot of updates in the Kupiansk direction. This is where the Russians have had a lot of progress this week. So we talked about how these villages right here, Klishchiivka, Klatorovka, all these villages form the outskirts of the first Ukrainian defense line before they reach Kupiansk. So Kupiansk is the main goal of the Russians, and this is where the Ukrainians are having their big defenses. However, they want to keep the Russians as far away from Kupiansk as possible, and so they had this defense line in Klishchiivka, Klatorovka, which held the Russians back, and they were far away from Kupiansk. However, this line of these villages of defenses that held the Russians back from southern Kupiansk has fallen. So we talked about the fall of Klishchiivka, Klatorovka, and this week we basically got confirmation that the Russians have fully captured the village of Ivanivka. This made sense because after Klishchiivka fell, not only were the Russians on the outskirts of Ivanivka, they now could have assaulted it from the south here. And because they took Klishchiivka, they were able to attack it on two sides, and the garrison in Ivanivka fell back to Stepova Novomykhailivka here. I'm expecting that basically the Russians will try to clear up Ivanivka, and then the Russians also made some advances along this rail line, which they're going to continue doing. So one thing we'll have to look out for is that Stepova Novomykhailivka is the last village in line before the Russians reach the southern Kupiansk defenses. And however, I think the Russians aren't going to move through these fields, in my opinion, because that's going to be very dangerous to move because of FPV drones and all that. But I do believe the Russians will secure themselves in this first defense line so that the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Kupiansk. And so with Ivanivka falling, one thing we will see is the Russians will continue moving along this rail line. They'll kind of reach this kind of intersection here, and once they reach this, they'll be able to again outflank Stepova Novomykhailivka and basically do what they did with Ivanivka and attack it on two sides, capture it, and then the Russians will probably try to secure their flanks up here, kind of use these ravines as like natural defenses. Something kind of go like this. This will be the Russian kind of where the Russians will hold their positions, and the Ukrainians will fall back to southern Kupiansk, and then this will be a good tactical victory for the Russians, and it will allow them to, if the Russians make a break, they'll have to, my opinion is that the Russians will try to focus in one area of this, like, Oskol front, and try to break through into the Oskol River. But, that wherever they break through, that'll be, then they'll be able to activate on every other part of this front. So Ivanivka has fallen. Another thing in more southern part of this direction is that the Russians have captured the village of Berestova. The Russians managed to move down from this small little village here, and they captured these two villages in February, and now they took the village of Berestova by storm. What's the significance of this is not only do they continue expanding in the southern direction here, just as this is the northern direction of this defense line in Kupiansk, but also this also supports. The Ukrainians have a line of defense in Slimnaflikla, Myrshirovka, and Andriivka, and they were able to hold off the Russians because they had secure flanks, and the Russians would have to advance through the fields, which was very dangerous. However, with the fall of Berestova, and I'm expecting basically that the Russians in Novomykhailivka will kind of meet up with these two forces, and they will kind of secure themselves along these tree lines right here. Secure themselves, kind of have a good natural defense here, and then they'll be able to attack Stimlaflika from the north. And this is how basically the Russians like to fight, or this is how you fight in this small, grinding, attritional war. You slowly gain tactical victories so that you could have better tactical positioning, and then also take more land. The fall of Berestova basically allows the Russians the ability to outflank Stimaflika from the north, and basically not only will the Russians be able to attack it directly, they'll be able to attack it from the north. And that will facilitate the fall of Slimaflika, and by extension, this entire line of defense of Myrshirovka and Andriivka, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Lozova, Vyshina, and kind of this defense line through these villages in the Kharkiv Oblast. We actually say the Russians are already trying to improve their positions in front of this main defense line in these three villages. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken this small village of Myrshirovka and basically split this defense between Andriivka and Slimaflika. And we saw geolocated footage of Russians being right on the outskirts. We don't know if they're in the village itself, but if they are this close, then I don't doubt that the Russians could probably enter this village, capture the middle of it, and then as the Russians invade from the north, they'll have a position in the south, and then, that's game over. You'll be able to attack this village in three directions, and then force them out, and force them back here in Lozova. Not only will this, again, get them closer to the Oskol River, again, it's taking, just as taking this will get them one step closer to Kupiansk, but also this is a political objective because these three villages are in the Luhansk Oblast, and capturing these three villages is, the Russians, will be kind of, while has some tactical, it's not like a big breakthrough or whatever, but it does help secure the Russians. Hey, we have 100% of control of the Luhansk Oblast, which right now they only have like 98, 99% of it, which you might, it's like a political victory. It's not necessarily like a battlefield, like some sort of big win, but it does help the Russians in a propaganda sense. So, the fall of Berestova does facilitate the Russians will be able to take these 3 villages more easier in the near future. In the Liman front, there's been some saying that the Russians have improved their positions by a bit in front of Dubrova, just trying to improve their, took like a few tree lines here and improved a little north here, just to put some distance between Toskoye and Dubrova, and also to secure the southern defense of this Torskoye salient. With the advance on Terny, which kind of bogged down, kind of bogged down. But one thing the Russians did do, while they did not reach Terny, they did secure kind of the northern defense of this kind of Torskoye salient, which kind of protruded. So they're now kind of improving the southern defenses of this salient here. Let's now go to the Siversk front, and this is actually, again, where the Russians are also advancing. The Russians, according to Russian MOD, they have completely captured the village of Bilogorivka after 1 year of combatants. This has been one of the most fought over villages. It's been very hard to take. It's probably been it's one of these really grinding. It's been a tough fight for the Russians and Ukrainians. But we got confirmation. I was kind of skeptical at first, because Bilogorivka, while is on the low ground, and the Ukrainians still had control of the chalk shop, or the chalk mountain, or whatever the fuck this is called, and the hills to the west of Bilogorivka. And since they dominated the heights, I said that maybe they could be pushed out of the village, but the Russians won't be able to keep positions here. But we saw confirmation that the Russians raised their flag around the center of the town. And that, I think that solidified that, yes, the Russians are in Bilogorivka. So we got geolocated footage of the Russians here. I'm assuming that the Russians will now try to at least secure one part of the high ground and try to do an assault on the mountain here. And they could do this. They are right outside it, and they don't have to advance very far to get up it. It will be a bit of a battle, but now that if Bilogorivka is indeed captured, they could attack this mountain on 3 sides and try to capture it. Now, this is like, they might as well be fighting on the moon here, because, this map is updated. You could see that, because if you look at Bilogorivka, you could see it's completely razed to the ground. There's nothing left here. It looks like the moon. So it's very much a very empty village. And but again, this is also the capture of Bilogorivka is more of a propaganda thing, because once they do capture it, the Ukrainians could still hold the Russians back at Grigorivka, Siverbranka, and then they can't advance longer because the Ukrainians still have positions in the Siverbransky forest, and so they'll be able to attack across the river and delay the Russians from reaching the northern part of Siversk. So I'm pretty certain that they're not going to continue advancing here until they have some success in this forest here. But one thing I will say is that is that the capture of Bilogor is more of a propaganda victory for the Russians, because again, this is part of the Luhansk Oblast, and the Russians want to say, hey, we have 100% of control of the Luhansk Oblast. But in order to fully secure this gain, they have to at least take this chalk mountain. And if they don't, then I expect that this capture of the village itself, it would be very untenable to hold. But we shall see if the Russians continue building on their success in Bilogorivka. But one thing they also have done, however, is also advance in the south here. They've been slowly advancing through these fields here and getting closer to the villages of Sporna, Ivanodarivka, and Vimka. We saw Russian troops geolocated on this tree line. We saw Russian troops geolocated on this tree line right here. And so the Russians are slowly but surely, very slowly, kind of moving themselves north of this area and slowly getting closer to Sporna, Ivanodarivka, and Vimka. This is where the Ukrainians have their defenses here, and this is kind of forms the southern defenses of Siversk. So the Russians are slowly but surely reaching it, but again, these villages are wiped off the face of the planet. There is nothing left here. If you look at Ivanodarivka, it looks like, again, everything here is destroyed. You could also say the same thing with Vimka. This might be Vimka right here. Yeah, Vimka. As you can see, this is completely razed to the ground. There's nothing left here. These aren't really villages anymore, but they, they can be taken by the Russians want to reach here so that they could have a, the defense, the Russians will want to not only secure Luhansk Oblast, they also want to be able to be, in the southern outskirts of Siversk. So Again, most of this is just to put pressure on the Ukrainians here. On the Chasiv Yar front, the Russians are continuing their offensive to try to take the Canal district, and it is a very bloody affair. The Russians are making small progress in the northern part, still trying to cut off. The Russians have fully secured the southern defenses of the canal, but they're still grinding in the north. One thing is that the battle for Klishchiivka has started. Some sources are saying the Russians are now battling the Ukrainians in this area right here in Klishchiivka, and they are trying very hard to break through and reach the canal right here. And what this does prove is that Bogdanovka, is completely under Russian control, and now the Battle of Klishchiivka has started. And Klishchiivka is a village the Russians have to take in order to secure the northern defenses as they advance towards Chasiv Yar. So the Battle of Klishchiivka has started. They have entered and are battling for these two streets right here. The Russians are also advancing along this rail line and are advancing in the dachas of this canal zone right here. They have taken, they're still advancing along this rail line and trying to clear the dachas in the north. In terms of the canal itself, it's a bit of a fog of war. No one really, we saw the Russians enter this and start battling for areas, but sometimes we get footage of the Russians bombing it, and we see Russians here, but then we see the Russians bomb here. It's very much a fog of war. It's hard to know who controls what here. Right now, the Syriac, the map I'm using, you kind of just geolocates where the Russians have been shown, but and kind of colors where the Russians have bombed as part of the Ukrainians, and that's fair. But one thing to keep in mind is that the Russians might enter this area, but then push the Ukrainians out of here and then bomb this area, and then it might be more of a gray zone here. Than we might expect. So it's this canal itself is very much in the fog of war. However, I think it's fair to say the Russians do have some sort of positioning here, and it's not completely under Ukrainian control. So we'll see how the Russians continue developing their success in the canal zone, or at least in the canal district, as they try to reach the canal, or the canal. One thing that's very interesting is that this week is the Russians made a big breakthrough here and recaptured the villages of Klishchiivka and Andriivka. This is very good news for the Russians. Because not only did they capture the village itself, they managed to capture the hills to the north of it. And that is what's important, because the capture of these hills basically gives them the dominant position to overlook any Ukrainian positions in the fields to the east of the canal zone in the south here. The Ukrainians have positions, here, here, and the forests right here. But with the fall of these heights, this very much complicates the Ukrainians in the southern defenses of Chasiv Yar. And so the Russians made a bit, this is very psychologically damaging to the Ukrainians, because this reverses their gains in Bakhmut. The entire northern part got erased, and but now all their gains in the southern part of Bakhmut are getting erased. So all the gains of the Ukrainian counteroffensive are being slowly rolled back. The fall of Klishchiivka and Andriivka will allow the Russians to continue developing their success and pushing the Ukrainians towards the southern part of the Siversk Canal. Because again, they need to take the center Chasiv Yar itself. They need to not only secure themselves in the north. They're going to again try to encircle this on three sides. This is like a microcosm of what we're going to expect in the summer for the Battle of Chasiv Yar. This is a small section of it, and as you see, the Russians advance in the south. They're now trying to advance in the north, and they're going to try to advance directly to it. But they're going to try to put like a bow constrictor on it on three sides. But in order to do that from the south, they need to clear these fields here. And the fall of Klishchiivka and Andriivka will allow the Russians to do that. Let us now talk about the Donetsk front here. The Russians have started they've been some rotations here, so it's been a bit of a slowdown here for the last week or two. However, the Russians have restarted offensive actions and are now pushing. One thing to keep in mind here is the Russians are now right on the outskirts of Sokol. The Ukrainians have a very strong defense trench network here, but the Russians are now slowly encircling Sokol. The Russians not only are on the outskirts of Sokol, taking the tree line that's right on the outskirts of the village right here, but they also are advancing to the north here. Some sources are saying the Russians are trying to take, a train station that is right here, like they're trying to take the northern part of Sokol, and they're slowly advancing along this rail line. And this is facilitated by the fact that the Russians are slowly but surely they say they have entered the outskirts of Nova Alexandrivka here, and also trying to take this tree line right here, which will allow the Russians to encircle Sokol from the north. The Russians are also slowly, moving along the fields and trying to outflank Kalinova from the west here, and the Russians are, advancing on this tree line and managed to take this area right here. The thing with Kalinova, this is what the Ukrainians fell back to. It's a very strong defense line because after the fall of, Karamik, Novokilanova, Arkhangelska, and all that, the Ukrainians have these like water barriers to support themselves here. So a direct attack from here was stopped. So the Ukrainians have good chances here. However, if the Russians manage to outflank them from the west here, this will be, there's really no really good defense if the Russians manage to enter, this area, this operational field, these fields right here, and they manage to attack Kalinova from the west. This will facilitate the fall of that village, and the Russians are trying to again bloom from the Chechny flower. So they're doing small gains, and these small gains will improve the tactical positioning as they try to take Nova Alexandrivka and Sokol. Along with this, the Russians are advancing in the south here. Again, they're tank going slowly to Novopokrovska. And in order to do that, alrighty, sorry about that. Alrighty, let's continue talking about Novopokrovska. So the Russians are also advancing in the south, as I mentioned, trying to encircle Sokol from the south. But as they do that, they are also approaching Novopokrovska from the north because the Ukrainians have two lines of defense here. The Ukrainians had a line of defense in Sokol that reached the Vochachka River, but they also had defenses in Novopokrovska, Novoselyka, Pershi. These are like two Ukrainian defense lines. However, if the Russians manage to get between them, they can, and they're advancing to the north here, towards the village of Poris, but they're also advancing kind of between these as they try to encircle the north here. And as the Russians are also advancing the south here, and so the Russians again are putting the squeeze on these two lines of Ukrainian defenses here, and the Russians are also advancing from their these positions in Berezh and Sinidovka and are reaching the outskirts of Novopokrovska. These are open fields, and the Ukrainians have a easy time to pick out Russians advancing here. However, the Russians have advanced and are now taking tree lines in this general direction and they're trying to slowly but surely the Russians are moving trying to basically reach the outskirts of Novopokrovska so that they could encircle Sokol from the south. But they need to slowly make gains along these tree lines in order to do that. Speaking of the south, the Russians have we mentioned about the complete capture of Umanska. However, now we have confirmation that the Russians are slowly but surely pushing their way around this area. The Russians are reaching this river ravine right here, and I have no doubt that the Russians are right now basically going to use this water ravine as the next defense line. I'm pretty certain the Russians are right now trying to capture this tree line right here, and that the capture of this will basically allow the Russians to have a natural defense in the north here. And then with the northern part secured, they'll be able to continue their focus advancing towards the Vochachka River. The Russians also managed to capture basically this entire tree line right here. This connects Nitailova and Umanska, which basically connects the Russian advance in Nitailova and Umanska. The Russians are not done yet. The Russians will keep advancing until they reach the Vochachka River. So one thing I do expect is the Russians will storm Yasnobrodovka, kind of maybe advance here, take these tree lines. They'll be able to push the Ukrainians from the north, and from the south here, and they'll be able to take this area right here. And then once this is done, the Russians will be able to use the Vochachka River as a natural defense, probably advance along here, but then also advance and reach right in this area, choke point right here. This will be the outer skirmish area right here. And then the Russians will stop. The Ukrainians have built they have a lot of defenses on the western side of the Vochachka River, and the Russians won't advance through here because then they'll have like a bottleneck here for supply. So if the Russians try to advance out of here and try to secure positions here, they'll be choked up. But again, the Russians are just here to push the Ukrainians' artillery away from Donetsk. So, once they reach here, and and then let's talk about kind of more here. The Rush, we talked about also the complete fall of Natalova. This was confirmed by the Russian MOD. One thing also that's confirmed is the Russians are now clearing the farms to the south of Natalova. So the Natalova city itself has fallen. There's farms to the south, which there's been some geolocated footage of the Russians being droned here. However, we don't know if the farms have completely fallen, but I'm pretty certain that if Natalova has fallen, especially since we saw Russian troops here, then since they have the most western part of Natalova under their control, I have no doubt the Russians will clear this area and kind of use this water ravine as the new natural defense line. So the farms are being cleared up in Natalova, and this will also facilitate, again, the fall of Yasna Bronovka, because they'll be able to advance here. They might not even advance all the way here. They might just advance, right here or something like that, because, and then this will be like a no man's land type thing, because the Ukrainians don't want to like have this as a, it'll be very hard to supply, because if the Ukrainians are here, this is the only way they'll be able to get supplied. So, they'll be shelled very easily. And also, the fall here will be able to allow the Russians to advance along the Vychachka River and start moving through these fields and start, attacking and flanking the Ukrainians in Novoselivka, Pershi, and the Sokol area. So the Russians making advances along the fields, and this is allowing them to have a success in their advance as they try to clear the Ukrainians from Donetsk. And what the Russian goal here is kind of like this. This will be where the Russians will want to be at. This is where the Russians want to capture for this summer, and then they'll probably stop at this point and then focus on another area of the front, because the troops here need rest, and they have had rest. But this will achieve the operational goal of pushing the Ukrainian artillery away from the Donetsk, at least from the northern sector. But this is the goal of the Russians for this summer as they continue pushing the Ukrainians from Avdiivka and towards Pokrovsk. In the Krasnohorivka sector, the Russians are still battling, and they are making small gains here. The Russians, they have captured the main defense in the refractory plant, and the Russians have been geolocated, basically battling for what I call the business district. This is like the center of the town. The factory was like the big factory, the big defense, but this is the Ukrainians could still put up a fight in these high-rise buildings. You can see these high-rise buildings in the center of the town, and the Russians are now battling for it. The Ukrainians still have some positions in these business districts and these businesses. The Russians are still battling for this hospital to the north here. The Russians are clearing the tree lines to the north here, and I'm pretty certain the Russians will try to continuously enter these warehouses right here, take this forest right here and start encircling Krasnohorivka from the north, because they are pushing out of this area. But the Ukrainians are trying to fight very hard for these high-rise buildings, because if they lose these high-rise buildings, then the entire eastern defense of Krasnohorivka will fall, and nothing will stop the Russians. So the only thing holding the Russians back is the Russians trying to clear up these business districts. So they're going, high-rise building to high-rise building, which takes a little while, and also these high-rise buildings right here. Basically, this fate of Krasnohorivka will be sealed if this hospital, these high-rise buildings, and the remainder of whatever is left of this business district is taken by the Russians. The Russians are focusing on that right now. They made gains. They also managed to capture these warehouses to the west here, and basically are now securing their western flank of Krasnohorivka. But if these areas fall, then there's nothing that's going to stop the Russians. That will see the fate of Krasnohorivka. Now, the Krasnohorivka is big, it's long, it's thick, but you can see the Russians will have to take a lot of time clearing it. But regardless, it's just a bunch of little residential housing from that point forward, and there's no doubt the Russians will be able to advance once those areas fall, and advance and get into this area right here, and get something like this here. So that'll be where the Russians want to push. They won't be able to continue pushing because the Ukrainians have a line of defense along the Vychachka River here, and they won't be able to. There's no positions for the Russians to take up in these fields. But again, the whole purpose was to push the Ukrainian artillery all the way back, and at least taking Krasnohorivka and reaching this line right here will secure that for them. There's been some changes in the Novomykhailivka area. The Russians have entered the village of Pereskovka and have taken about 3/4 of the village. The Ukrainians are still trying to fight kind of for this area right here, the kind of more northern part. But I'm, with the Russians in the center of the village, it's only a matter of time before the Russians clear this area and manage to take this area for sure. The capture of Pereskov is not just another village that falls. The tactical significance of taking this village, basically, we're just going to see another rerun of Novomykhailivka. If you remember the battle for Novomykhailivka or the winter, the Russians had to slowly grind in the north. They had to slowly grind from the south. And once that happened, were they able to take Novomykhailivka by storm. The same thing is going to happen for the battle for Kostyantynivka. The Russians will have to redo everything they're doing in Novomykhailivka. In Paris, the Pereskov is a good first step for a springboard to continue, offensive actions to try to start encircling Kostyantynivka from the north. Maybe storm this dacha right here. But then also, not only will this help secure Pomeba, but also the Russians are pushing in the south. There's been some that the Russians managed to take this tree line right here. And so the Russians are slowly but surely also getting to the south of Kostyantynivka, trying to reach this highway. And so, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to put the squeeze on Kostyantynivka, but this is going to take a while. This might take a few months. So, but it is this is another area where the Ukrainians have to hold the Russians back. In the Velika Novoselka area, the Russians are slowly entering. They took the farms and warehouses in southern Uruzhaina, and now the Russians are entering the first actual residential area of Uruzhaina. Are starting to fight for the first remnants of the southern parts of the town here. The Russians are making most progress in Starmayorska. They have taken the southern, and they are now have secured themselves in the center of the village, and now they are trying to take the more western part or the eastern part of the village right here. And now, basically the sources say the Ukrainians are now just in the northern sector of the village, kind of. Everything on this road and north is where the Ukrainians are at, and the Russians are kind of south of that. Starmayorska is slowly falling, and this is a place where the Ukrainians their counteroffensive gains are being pushed back. So it is a bit of a, kind of sad for them. But, we'll see how they continue developing. Because once Starmayorska falls, this will facilitate the fall of Uruzhaina. So, the Russians will secure Starmayorska, and then they will cross the river here and take Uruzhaina from two sides, and Uruzhaina will fall. And the Russian defense line will go something like this, more or less. I think this is just a pressure point. This isn't like a big Russian push, but again, the Russians are pushing everywhere to keep the Ukrainians on their toes. In the Robotyne, Zaporizhzhia area, the Russians are, again, still trying to clear the fields between Verbova and Robotyne. I talked about this last time. The Russians are trying to basically push the Ukrainians all the way back to Orekov. But right now there's this constant tree line right here, which will basically flatten the front line. And so the Russians are slowly but surely advancing. For example, this week they took this tree line. And, last week, we saw the Russians take the northern part of Robotyne. And right now the Russians are slowly but surely squeezing the Ukrainians out of this pocket right here and pushing them back where they're back here. But I think this is just, again, this is like Starmayorsk and Uruzhaina. The Russians are pushing here, so the Ukrainians can't pull forces from the Zaporizhzhia direction. And there is some tactical significance, but I don't think they're going to continue advancing towards Orekov, in my opinion. The Kherson front, there was no changes. A lot of sources are saying that, like, the Ukrainians gave up Krinky and trying to advance here. Because they put so much troops in Kharkiv that they had to stop their offensive in Kherson. We don't have 100% confirmation of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. This was a waste of time anyway for them. This gave them no success at all. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they gave up trying to take Krinky. Yeah, so that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoy these updates I give you for these, what's happening on the ground. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and yeah, so aim high and wander on.